Hello, my name is Ashley Basham, and I'm going to be talking to you about chapters 1 through 3 in our textbook. And the first thing that I'm going to be discussing is chapter 1. Chapter 1 highlights the 3 stages of basic design, and basically what it does is it takes the unit plan and it breaks it down into 3 stages that really gets in depth with what you want to learn in the unit. The first stage is outline of design. This is where you do your goals, your big ideas, your understanding, what you want the students to know. Here in Texas, what TEKS it covers. If you're in a different state, it might not be TEKS, but here in Texas, we'll just go with TEKS. And what your overall end result that you want to achieve. It's basically like your hypothesis, if you're speaking in scientific terms. It's everything that you want or everything that you're expecting to come out of this lesson plan, which then folds into stage 2. Stage 2 is the assessment of evidence. This assessment evidence can be a warm-up, it can be your assignments, it can be what tasks will you provide the students, how will you perform judgment on if the students are doing the assignment well. Like I said, what assessments, like quizzes, tests. It could also be maybe you have them do a project, maybe you have them do an assignment of some sort to show that they are comprehending the lesson. And then that follows into stage 3, which is the learning plan. The learning plan is very basically simple, and they have it outlined in, I don't think this form's a word, but it's WHERETO. And if you want to, you can split it and put where to, which kind of makes sense. Where are you going? So the where to in this text, I really love how this is set up. And the W stands for where we're going, what's expected, and where students are coming from. The H is hook interest and kind of hold their interest. We always talk about holding, like getting their interest, engaging the students, but once you engage them, you need to hold it. And I love how this model really homes in on, once you hook them, you got to hold them. And then we're talking about the equipment. What equipment are you going to use? What assessments are you going to use? Are you going to use any technology? What are you going to use? And then it's also another, for the E, would be the experience ideas and what are they going to explore. I know especially in science there's so much they can explore, and that's where you'd outline it in this lesson plan. The R represents rethinking and revise, and this gives the students time to evaluate what they have done. Students always want to get to the end result, want to get to that grade. That's the horrible part of our teaching today, is we train the students that the grade is what matters, and that's not what matters. We need to rethink, revise, look at what we did, how did we get there, and that R really captures that. The next thing it talks about is evaluate. It's another E, but it's a whole different E. We're evaluating the students. We're not looking at equipment or the beginning stage of what we're using. We're at the end stage now, and we need to evaluate the students. Did the students perform the work correctly? Did the students understand the work? And then that folds into the next one, which is T, which is tailor. Do we need to tailor any of the information to students? Inclusivity is big in ISDs nowadays, especially with realizing that each student is an individual, and we need to tailor our lessons to the students and cover, if they have sensory, include some sensories, include visuals, documentation, whatever gets the students able to learn. Because the whole point of this is making sure the students understand, the students learn. And the last one is organize. And I know whenever I had my classroom last year, some people made fun of me because I was so organized. But organization is key. If you live in chaos, and if your life is chaos, then expect chaos. If you're organized, and if you have everything neatly filed, and if you have your lesson plans neat, if you have everything categorized, then it helps the students flow easier. And I know there's so much going on with teaching, and I know there's so much you have to do as a teacher that organization is probably the last thing on your mind, but taking a few extra seconds in the day to be organized can go a very, very long way. The next thing that appeared in chapter 1 was the nutrition example. It basically took the idea of the 3 stages and blew it up into this example for a nutrition classroom or for a nutrition unit plan. And it had so many good stages, like the where-tos were on point. It didn't really have a lot of organization, but other than that, the where-tos were on point. The goals, it outlined, I'm going to say TEKS, because that's what we use in Texas, but it didn't have a goals that the students can relate to. And whenever we're looking at goals, that's one thing as a teacher we need to keep in mind, is we can put the TEKS on the board. And even as teachers, when we read the TEKS, we might have to read it a couple times because there's a lot of big words, there's a lot of in-depthness, and students, like I teach, I work with 6th through 8th grade, and I know if I throw some of those big words at some of my 8th graders even, they're going to look at me like I'm crazy. So we can't just put like the TEKS on the board and say, here, that's our goal. You need to put a goal that's understandable to the students, because if the students don't understand what it is they're doing, they're not going to be hooked, they're not going to be engaged, they're not going to understand what they're doing, and if you start out lost, well, then you're just going to end up lost. And so that's one thing it was missing, and I wish it included, but that to me is a big thing that it needs. Another thing that I noticed is, it didn't really outline any of the tasks. It had 2 projects, and that was it. And projects are great, but there needs to be a little more than just projects. Learning in a fun environment is a good way to get students to learn, but you can't just do projects all the time. There has to be something a little more, like a vocab sheet, or maybe like I'm trying to think of the word, maybe like a hide and seek game, like you learn something and you have to find the answer, you get a word and you have to find the definition, something like that. You can't just have projects, which I get this is an example, and I get, it's to be understood in moderations. But other than that, like the quizzes it had, the self-assessments, everything tied in quite nicely together. And it was a good example for me to really understand what it was trying to get me to read, what it was trying to get me to understand, and what it was trying to get me to realize with a unit plan. From there, we move on to chapter 2, and I actually quite enjoyed reading chapter 2. It was actually one of my favorite chapters of the 3. It talked about understanding, and it talked about knowledge. And whenever you think of understanding and knowledge, most would perceive that to be the same thing, or something and follows in succession to the other. But on page 38, it had a table of knowledge and understanding and the differences between the two. And that table really pointed out the 2 differences in the knowledge and understanding. And it really captured, this is the difference, this is the line. And I'm just going to point out a couple of bulletins. Like for knowledge, it includes the facts, the body of coherent facts, the right and wrong. And then understanding is, instead of knowing the facts, like I can tell you, a math fact off the top of my head, but the meaning behind the fact is what makes it. That's the understanding. You can know facts every day, you can spit them out, but knowing the facts, understanding the facts, that's the biggest key. And then knowing the theories, the end process theories, and so forth. And then I went on to further talk about Berner's ideas, his 3, trying to think of the name, 3 traditional coverage approach. And he really pointed out some issues in the education system, and he points them out as unconventional. And when I read them, I can see where he's coming from for unconditional. For his first one, he talks about the difficulty for students to generalize from learning to what will be encountered. a classroom setting is a classroom setting. You have desks in a row, you have a teacher teaching. There's no real world circumstances. And I know when I was in elementary school, we had days where we would pretend like, oh, we were going to a diner, and we would have to act out like paying for the tab and stuff like that. That would be what we need to incorporate more, so that way students understand how to function in the real world. After 12 years, we established you can sit in a desk, you can read a textbook, and you can spit out information. How can you apply that to a real world? And that's what we're kind of missing in today's education. And Berner really pointed that out in his first idea. His other idea was there's little reward in terms of intellectual excitement, meaning you learn the information, you get an A on the test, you're happy, you move on. There's no real like end result. You know, it's just a constant cycle of you did good on a test, great, 100, move on. It just is an endless cycle. There's no big reward like, oh, it's your birthday kind of reward. It's disconnected. And the third one is the knowledge required with structure to tie together. If you don't tie information together, it's likely to be forgotten. And he was really pointing that out. And I believe this wholeheartedly. If you do not link your information together, the students won't remember it. They'll remember it for the test and then they'll forget it. In elementary school, they have you sing songs to remember the information, and some of those songs I can still sing today, and that was 20 years ago from when I was in elementary school. And so when looking at his models, we move on, and it started talking about a lot of misconceptions on page 54 about education. So we go from Berner's model to some flaws in education to some misconceptions about education. And it talked a lot about not only just misconceptions in specific subjects, but misconceptions in general. And I got to thinking about misconception in mathematics, and it got me to really thinking, one thing that I always tell my students that is a complete misconception is I can name several of my students, even several of my peers, that tell me that the answer is the goal. And I will argue differently on that because it's not the answer in mathematics. Yes, 2 + 2 = 4. We get that. We understand the answer is 4. But the answer is not the end definition. The process you got there is what makes the answer. You can put an answer on a page, it can be right. But if you don't know the process and how to get there, then how are you going to do it in a future situation? You know, if you're going to the grocery store and you need to add your groceries, if you don't know how to add and all you know is, oh, there's an answer, somehow I got the answer, then there's no understanding. And I always say the journey is more important than the destination, because you can climb a mountain and you can go through all that hard work climbing that mountain, and when you get there you see this beautiful sunset or this beautiful view, and that is your reward. But what's the point of just seeing that reward every day? It loses its value if you don't do the climb to get to that beautiful sunset. And so it's the climb and it's the journey that matters more than just seeing that view every day. And then another big misconception is, and I'm probably going to get a lot of backlash from this, and you might not agree with me, and that's okay, but this is my viewpoint on it. And what we learn in the classroom is not always applicable to what we learn in life. I know to this day, the only time I've used Pythagorean theorem is in the classroom because I'm a teacher. It's my job as a teacher to teach it. But my students, unless they're going to be in construction or some type of engineering, they'll never use it. They use things like PEMDAS, like the process of elimination. They use percentages, adding, subtracting, dividing, multiplication. That is what they use on a daily basis, and that I can understand. And that I would understand teaching and relating it to real world. But whenever it comes to things like, you know, Pythagorean theorem, or whenever it comes to Freyr's model, not very many students are going to use that in the real world. And we tell the students on a daily basis, You're going to use this in the real world. You're going to use this in the real world. Well, quite frankly, I'm 24 years old, and the only time I've used Pythagorean theorem is for school because I'm a teacher. And my family makes jokes at me all the time because I'm a math teacher. They always ask me, well, you don't use this in real life. What's the point of teaching it? I can't answer that because there is no point. That's just what the state wants us to teach, because maybe someday they'll be an architect and they might use it. But other than that, it has no real value. So we use the term, use it in the real world, too loosely, because we don't always use it in the real world, and not everything is of a real world value. And that's just something I see as a misconception. That's something I feel strongly about. And then the last misconception is the grading. I know for other teachers it's different, but as a math teacher, the answer is not the grade. And what I mean by that is whenever you grade a paper as a math teacher, you're not just, oh, the answer is 52, so it must be right. No, you have to look at the process. If they got the process right, if they did the math correctly, then it's right. It's not just the answer, which goes back to my first one. It's not just the answer that matters. As a math teacher, we don't grade on just you getting the right answers. We grade on the work it gets there. That's why we turn blue in the face telling you, please show your work, because that is what we grade on. That is what we see to make sure you understand what we are saying. And so that's just a few things that it went over, and it was a really almost touching chapter because it really got me to think about what I find as misconceptions in the classroom and really what my students think of the classroom in a sense. And then the last chapter was chapter 3, and it talked about big ideas. And on page 64, it really outlined some characteristics of some big ideas. 69. And one of them is the broad aspect, it's the big picture, it's the, like, if I'm going to teach geometry today, my lesson is going to be on geometry, Pythagorean theorem. It is the, we're going to learn PEMDAS and everything that goes with PEMDAS. It represents one or two words. It's like an umbrella is the best way to put it. You have your big idea, and everything underneath it that goes with this big idea is in your umbrella. And that is the best way to describe it, is your big idea is your umbrella, and then all your topics underneath the umbrella. And like I said, with math, it would be like, if we're going to teach PEMDAS, well, to teach PEMDAS, you need to know adding, subtracting, dividing, exponents. You need to know all that stuff to perform PEMDAS. And so a big idea is multiple. It is multiple things, and it is like an umbrella, and it is your main point. It is your main idea, to so speak in English terms. And then on page 77, it wanted us to reflect about one of the main ideas and one of the big points and why it's a big idea. And I chose the cooking one because I cook all the time. And in the textbook it says, "And cooking minimizes waste and increases taste by use scraps as stock." What this means is if you have waste, just put it in the pot with some boiling water and it makes stock. You can make vegetable stock, you can make chicken stock, beef stock, pork stock. You get where I'm going with this. And the reason I found this as a big idea is because we don't do this anymore. We just go out and we just buy stock. We're lazy and we just go out and buy stock. So there's no need to make stock anymore. But back in the olden days, there was rations. You didn't always have access to, oh, I'm going to go out and buy some stock. No, you had to make your own stock. You had to plan ahead of time to make gravy. You needed that grease from the bacon that you cooked that morning before. You needed the scraps, and back then they just used everything, and that still applies today with cooking. You can use everything. Not everything is waste. Waste not, want not is a term my grandmother says all the time, and as you know, teachers, think that's something we can incorporate not just in cooking but in our teaching, not waste a single moment and not be wasteful. So those are just kind of my big ideas. Speaking of big ideas, those are just kind of my ideas on these 3 chapters and what these 3 chapters represent and how they really incorporate from unit plans to understanding, knowledge, and understanding, and really getting in depth with, you know, ideas and putting everything in an umbrella. That's what these 3 chapters basically are. They're basically putting everything that you need to know in an umbrella. Your unit plan, what is your big ideas in the unit plan? What are your ideas? And so these are some really interesting chapters, and this is the start of the textbook. And I really, if this is what the textbook is going to start out as, I'm really looking forward to the other chapters, because these chapters were so rich and so in depth and so helpful to teachers. And I cannot wait to read the rest of the chapters and see what more they have to offer. And I hope you have a good evening.